we were playing Sorcerer and Sword yesterday, we had a situation where uh, there was a battle uh, involved a castle, but it was being kind of laid siege to, and then the beginning of the day, the forces outside the castle were kind of moving in, and Todd was the GM and was trying to kind of figure out there was a need to kind of figure out how the larger battle would go.
Hey, you know,
I
that's
think
actually really relevant topic for other related issues that I have in my mind right now. So
because the
Mhm.
sorcerers were kind of dealing on a kind of smaller level, right? I mean, neither one of the player characters really in charge of the armies, but we were in the midst of the conflict, and here it looks like Rod is joining us now, so he'll
Ooh,
be able
okay.
to kind of talk about like, but there was a need of how do you negotiate the larger conflict than with the player characters that are kind of boots on the ground, needing to kind of sense what they can of how the larger conflict is going, and then take their own actions depending on if they were able to assess from how the larger battle was going.
Now, we have seen role playing games provide um, methods for this before. It's often, I mean, especially considering some of the origins of role playing lie in playing of battles and then wanting your smaller characters inside the battles to run around and do things and have adventures. I don't think that was ever quite as seamless as the way people talk in sort of nostalgic retrospect, but it was involved, right? We know that that was involved in the origin of role playing. But if I'm thinking, um, okay, first of all, kind of the big example for this for the games that we're all familiar with is Pendragon, because that has rules for conducting a battle and your players characters are in it and have some sort of smaller scale role in what's going on. Um, and then you also have games that have provided their own rules for that too. The two that come to mind, three that come to mind, are Legendary Lives. Remember, we actually used that in play, right? There was the Ross used the battle rules to figure out what was happening between the fanatics and the elves. Um, and then there was also um, Legend of the Five Rings, which used kind of a derived version of the Pendragon rules, if I'm not mistaken. The idea was that you had roles that determined how the battle was going in the bigger picture, but then you also had a personal role to see what sort of individualized kind of telescoping in opportunity we got to watch you doing in that context. Like suddenly, a great warrior would appear upon you and you would have to cope with it or something like that. But there was a system in place for how the bigger battle was going. Um, okay, so the question on the table that's really obvious is, well, how do you do that when playing sorcerer?
Or it
But
may
I
be
think it's what.
any
Go
game
ahead.
that doesn't have that kind of built in where you have some type of rule set up in advance, or because most, I think the majority of role playing games are
Right, they're
set
personal in
up.
scope mostly. For example, in Undiscovered, as your magic goes up considerably in level, if you look at the actual effects, it's, well, self only, radius of 5 feet, radius of 10 feet, radius of 20 feet is kind of the progression for a lot of the effects in Undiscovered. So the difference between you and Mighty Mage Supreme is 20 feet radius of effect, right? So this Sorcerer Supreme isn't going to be using this spell to take down the castle anytime soon. So then we have games where the magic especially jumps, right? Just jumps to. Without blowing my little horn too hard, can anyone think of the game of mine which specifically addresses this?
Troll Babe
There.
has that scaling up.
Right. So the idea is that if things that happen that are above the Troll Babe scale are dictated. The game master says what happens at that level, and there isn't any role that the Troll Babe can do to affect it at that scale. She might seek to go and kill the leader of that army or something, but even that isn't just a fast track to stopping the battle. Right? So stopping the battle is a larger scale of effect. If she can't do it, she can't. And I think Troll Babe just formalizes what typically happens in role-playing games. There's this presumed notion of scale of effect for your characters, and above it, well, guess what? That's not handled by our resolution system, and we're just not doing that. So that leads us to a couple of points. One, is that in and of itself a problem? Just to say the characters don't operate at that level, and since they don't operate at that level, hey Alexandra,
hello.
Since they don't operate at that level, then they just don't, and then they are subject to the vagaries of Game Master says or whoever says, or there's some process in play, some rule in play where you have roles, or you have tables, or you have some sort of resolution mechanism that you work out how the battle goes, more or less, usually concurrently with individual actions within it. The other game that came to mind was is a game that someone put a lot of effort into in the 2000s. It had several different names, but the one I know it by is Crimson Empire. And it had like a 6-booth space at Gen Con, and it had a pack of cards associated with it, and 10,000 pieces of art you could buy, and t-shirts, and a whole crew of people who came. And the guy kind of put his whole life into getting this game published, and that was the end of that. But he also had battle rules that were very different from Pendragon's. So I just bring it up because, credit where it's due. But okay, so what is our question here? First of all, let's take a game where there aren't rules for large-scale effects, but you're in a battle, just to pick battles as an example. So how is this conducted? What happens? When and how does your character have an impact on the outcome of the battle? Do they ever? So any examples you know of from your own experiences or games you know about, that would be useful. 2, games that do have rules for this, where we are in a battle now, or we are in some large-scale phenomenon. What do we do in it? How is it resolved? How do we resolve what we do in it, and how are the two related, if they're related at all? And then finally, games where you might think they don't have mechanisms for that to occur, but they kind of do. And I'm going to say Sorcerer is actually in that category. The answer in the case of Sorcerer is not, oh, then you turn the page and here are the battle rules, but rather, given the rules that exist, there are times when those roles will matter in it. But not always. So I might save that for its own answer. But before doing that, before getting all sorceress, what are your experiences with or perceptions of? What about Warhammer? I don't know Warhammer very well. I just have one of the editions, which is inadequate. I know Warhammer's. It's inadequate. I only have one edition, and I don't know much about it besides the fact that it looks like, somebody listened to a lot of Molly Hatchet and then played D&D. So, um, does Warhammer have any rules of this kind? Does anyone know? Oh, there we go. Right. Trust somebody in Europe to whip up a copy of Warhammer for us. That's for sure. Yeah. Aha.
I have two of them, so I'll check in a moment.
Okay.
In some time.
What other games do people remember or know about with rules like that? Yeah, Alan.
I'm recalling the 1982-80 version of Bushido had rules for outcomes of battles and what happened to characters in the battle.
Right.
But I don't believe they actually had a way of feeding back into like what the individual does has any effect on the bigger battle.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if that's the case in Legend of the Five Rings. I think the battle was resolved in some way, but what you had was more or less a battle encounter table.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. Yeah, I don't remember if there was maybe there was something that fed back. I don't know.
And the other one I can think of is Burning Empires.
That came to mind too.
Real application. Yeah.
That one's kind of interesting in that it's
a phase management system.
Yeah, that's a game, Burning Empires, that I am always pulling off my shelf. I'm always pulling it off my shelf and going flip. I think I get this. I say to myself, I think I get this.
I've had that experience, and then I go, what?
Well, my take is, I think I get this, but I don't want to run it. I just don't. Mm. But I kind of want to be in it. I can make it do. The life paths for the characters are so rich and everything. You can make somebody. The way Burning Empires works, as I understand it, is that you play factions against factions in this incredibly complicated setting of, science fiction, medievalism conflict. And then once you play like a whole phase of like what happens at that big factional level. And then you jump into the personal level. And then it's like you identify characters who you think would be cool to play in that context. And then you play those in kind of a little soap opera, drama, adventure. And I'm trying to remember if it occurs after all those big grand events, like, okay, now that's happened, what's a little adventure we can do? Or whether you go inside it so you kind of know what the outcome is going to be in the bigger picture and play something inside it. I don't remember which. So I know it alternates those phases of scale, but I don't know if they're sequential in time or if the little is back inside. Yeah,
I don't recall either.
But
the premise is based on a series of comics, basically.
Right.
It was about the invasion of a colonized area of space by some kind of mind worms. And the comics that I've read always had the big picture, but then you had some kind of individual action that became important to whether or not a planet was fell to the
right. So that's why I was wondering whether there's some kind of I think there's a point system. The points you accumulate in one of them becomes points for the next. I think that's how they do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an interesting system for that. But again, it's not really played concurrently, which is fine. That's one way to do it.